Before clocks existed, nobody was ever late. That concept simply didn't exist. You woke when the sun came up, you worked until it went down, and time was something you felt in your body, not something you checked on a screen. There was no schedule bearing down on you, no alarm yanking you out of sleep, no meeting you were already 3 minutes late to. Then someone built a machine that chopped the day into equal pieces, and the world was never the same again. This isn't just the history of clocks, it's the story of how time became a weapon, and how the people who controlled it controlled everything else. Welcome to Object Origins, where we dig into the history of everyday things and find out they were way more powerful, way more political, and way more strange than anyone told you. Today, we're pulling apart the history of clocks, and I promise, by the end of this video, you will never look at a clock the same way again. Here's what we're covering today. We're going to start in a world without mechanical time, where noon was a rough estimate and nobody owned your hours. Then we're going to watch the church take control of the clock and use it to run people's lives. After that, we're moving into factories, railroads, and the moment when time stopped being something you lived and became something you sold. And we'll end somewhere you might not expect, in your own pocket, with a device that knows the time down to the millisecond, and somehow that has made us less free than ever. Stay for the last point, because the paradox at the end of this story is one of the strangest things I've ever come across in the history of timekeeping. Quick note before we dive in. Everything covered here reflects well-documented historical research. Some interpretations, especially around power and social control, are actively debated by historians, so I'll flag where things get contested. Let's set the scene. It's the year 1200. You're a farmer in rural England, or France, or anywhere. It doesn't much matter. Your day is organized around light. Dawn means work starts. Dusk means it ends. Noon is the general neighborhood of midday. Nobody expects you at a specific hour. There's no grid of minutes and seconds pressing down on you. Time at this point in history is local and approximate. Different villages, different interpretations. Even the concept of an hour wasn't fixed. In some systems, hours were longer in summer, when daylight lasted longer, and shorter in winter. Time literally bent with the seasons. This is important to hold on to, because everything that comes next is a story about removing that flexibility, piece by piece, and replacing it with something rigid, mechanical, and controlled. So who pulled the first piece away? The first mechanical clocks appeared in Europe in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and they didn't go up in town squares or marketplaces first. They went up in monasteries. That's not an accident. Monastic life ran on a strict schedule of prayer, the canonical hours, 7 or 8 fixed points in the day when monks were required to stop everything and worship. To enforce that schedule, you needed a reliable signal, a bell. And to ring the bell at the right moment, you needed a machine. The mechanical clock was, at its origin, a religious control device. And here's how that power works in practice. The monastery rings the bell, and the entire surrounding community organizes around it. Market traders open when the bell rings. Workers start when the bell rings. The priest, and through him, the church, now owns the rhythm of everyone's day. Control the clock, control the community. This is one of the earliest and clearest examples in the history of timekeeping of how a technology of measurement immediately becomes a technology of power. By the mid-1300s, mechanical tower clocks were spreading across European cities. They were civic symbols, status symbols, and they were retraining entire populations to think in fixed, equal hours for the first time in human history. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, roughly the late 18th and 19th centuries, and the clock becomes something genuinely new, a labor contract. Here's the shift that matters. Before factories, most workers were paid for what they produced. A cobbler made shoes, you paid for the shoes. A weaver made cloth, you paid for the cloth. The output was the unit of exchange. Your time, strictly speaking, was your own. Factory owners changed this completely. They weren't buying output anymore. They were buying hours. Show up at 6 in the morning, leave at 8 at night. Your time, from that bell to that bell, belongs to the factory. This is what historians call time discipline, and it was a genuinely radical transformation in the human relationship with work. And workers resisted it. There are well-documented accounts of workers adjusting clocks, arriving late, leaving early, a constant low-level battle over who actually owned the hours of the day. Factory owners responded by moving clocks out of reach, locking them behind glass, fining workers for lateness. The clock, by this point, is openly an instrument of enforcement. This is, in one of its starkest forms, how clocks change the world, not just as tools, but as arguments. Arguments about whose time counts, who sets the pace, and who profits from the difference. We're about halfway through, and it's about to get bigger. Because what the railroads did next didn't just change time in one factory or one city, it standardized the entire planet. By the 1840s, rail networks were expanding fast across Britain and the United States, and they immediately ran into a problem that sounds almost comedic until you realize how dangerous it actually was. Every town ran on its own local time. Bristol was about 10 minutes behind London. Boston was about 12 minutes behind New York. These aren't rounding errors. These are real differences that, when you're trying to run trains on a shared track from a printed timetable, become collisions. Early railway schedules were a patchwork nightmare. A train leaving one city at noon arrived somewhere else at a time nobody could reliably predict because nobody agreed on when noon was. The solution, adopted progressively through the mid to late 19th century, was railway time, a standardized time that overrode local solar time. Britain adopted it fully by 1847. The United States formalized it in 1883. And in 1884, an international conference in Washington, D.C. divided the entire planet into 24 time zones, with the prime meridian running through Greenwich, England. Think about what that actually means. A group of governments sat in a room and decided that from this point forward, all of human time, across every country, every culture, every tradition of measuring the day, would be organized on a single coordinated grid. That is one of the most quietly radical acts of standardization in history. Local time, the time you could actually feel based on where the sun was, became officially irrelevant. And then Frederick Taylor came along with a stopwatch, and things got even more precise. In the early 20th century, Taylor developed what he called scientific management, the idea that factory work could be analyzed, broken into its smallest components, and optimized for maximum efficiency. His tool? Chronometry. Timing workers, timing every motion. Under Taylorism, it wasn't enough to own a worker's hours. You now owned their seconds. Every reach, every step, every hand movement was timed, recorded, and compared against an ideal. Workers weren't just labor, they were mechanisms to be tuned. This approach spread far beyond factories. It entered offices, hospitals, schools. The logic that efficiency equals measured time seeped into virtually every organized human activity across the 20th century. You can draw a remarkably straight line from Taylor's stopwatch to the productivity tracking software running on office computers right now. The history of clocks at this point is inseparable from the history of control. Which brings us to right now. Your smartphone displays the time to the second, synchronized automatically with atomic clock networks accurate to within nanoseconds. We are, by any measure, living in the most precisely timed era in human history. And yet, surveys conducted across multiple countries in recent decades consistently find that people feel they have less free time than their grandparents did. Researchers who study leisure time have noted that the expansion of precise timekeeping technologies has often correlated with a subjective increase in time pressure, not a decrease. The paradox is almost elegant in how bleak it is. The more precisely we can measure time, the less of it we seem to own. The medieval monk who rang the bell every 3 hours had more space between those bells than most of us have between notifications. The farmer who measured the day in light and dark had, in some genuine sense, a looser grip on his time, but it was his. We've inherited 6 centuries of refinement in the machinery of time control, and the main thing it's produced is the feeling that we're always running slightly behind. So let's run it back, because this is genuinely how clocks change the world, step by step. It started with the church, using mechanical bells to own the rhythm of community life in the 14th century. It moved into the factory, where time discipline transformed workers from people who sold their output into people who sold their hours. The railroads forced an entire planet to agree on what time it was, and the 1884 Time Zone Conference locked that agreement into the permanent architecture of civilization. Taylor's stopwatch reached inside those hours and began timing the seconds. And today, we carry atomic precision clocks in our pockets while collectively reporting that we've never felt more pressed for time. Quick reminder, as always, Interpretations of historical causation, especially around power and social control, involve genuine scholarly debate. The broad arc here is well supported, but history is rarely a single clean story. The real history of clocks isn't a story about gears and pendulums. It's a story about who owns the hours and how that ownership has shifted, century by century, further away from the person living inside them. The machine that once told you the sun was at its peak now tells your employer exactly how many minutes you spent away from your desk. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden history of ordinary things is what you're here for, you're in exactly the right place. Object Origins is built around exactly this, taking the objects you walk past every day and finding the power, the politics, and the strangeness buried inside them. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because there are a lot more everyday objects with stories like this one. And if you've got something you want us to dig into, drop it in the comments. I read them.